Depression is like a hopeless and all-consuming tsunami coming to wipe out the island that is your life. It's really hard to understand and relate to if you've never been there before. A lot of people who've never been through it hear depression and just think that it encompasses a level of sadness deeper than any other form. But the sorrowful reality is that it's so much more than that. Sure, sadness can come along with it, but it's catastrophically bigger than just that one emotion. Depression looks different for everyone, and it can affect anyone. Regardless of age, gender, race, or ethnicity, depression holds no bias. For some, it comes along with anxiety, pessimism, and helplessness. For others, it brings frustration, lack of energy, and an infuriating level of restlessness. Some of us experience it in the form of guilt, worthlessness, and an overall blank slate of emotions that just kind of feels empty inside, yet at the same time, it feels like a cauldron under a raging fire preparing to boil over at any moment. It can come with physical pain without any obvious cause. It can come with lack of interest in hobbies you once loved. It can come with changes in appetite, memory troubles, and oftentimes really dark thoughts. It's a dangerous mix of feeling trapped in a freezing cold and empty hole, meanwhile wrapped in a warm blanket of sorrow and lack of will in general. It hurts, and that's something that's hard to understand and relate to if you've never been consumed by it. One of the scariest parts about depression, though, is how it isn't always obvious. You can't just look at someone and inherently know that they're going through it. For a lot of people who struggle with depression on the outside, we sport a happy face and a positive demeanor, but deep down inside, there's an agonizing darkness, and if you saw it, you'd swear it wasn't us. Depression isn't plain as day. It's complicated. For some of us, we don't even realize that we're going through it. Of those that do recognize it though, some have enough courage to reach out, which is a huge deal. It takes a really strong person to be able to confide in their loved ones or a professional and let them know that they're struggling. However, that can be rocky terrain to navigate for a plethora of reasons. Sometimes it's as easy as having someone to talk to. It can be therapeutic to just verbalize your thoughts into the universe, whether it's falling on the ears of a psychologist or a loved one. There are times when just getting those thoughts out there for someone else to hear can help you process everything in real time as the words just continue to fall out of your mouth. Sometimes it isn't that easy though. There are times where the answer is a lot more complicated than just working through things verbally. The thing is, just like how depression looks different for everyone, working through that depression looks different for everyone as well. Sometimes it's a matter of prescriptions to change your brain chemistry. Some people lean into substances to numb the pain. Some people bottle everything up inside and pretend that it isn't happening. The way we as people approach trying to overcome our depression looks like a very wide spectrum, and what works for some oftentimes won't work for others. Some approaches are effective, and others are akin to putting a small band-aid on a gunshot wound. If you're someone who's struggling with depression, don't ever forget that there's hope for a light at the end of the tunnel, and there's help available to get you there. There are professionals who are trained to talk people through these kinds of situations. It goes without saying that your closest loved ones would rather hear your voice and talk you through your struggles rather than attend your funeral, feeling like there's something they should have done or signs that they didn't pick up on. As it relates to me personally, I recently opened up to you guys about my dad's battle with cancer and him being put on hospice. So, originally, when I recorded this video a few days ago, this part was me talking about how thankful I am that he's still hanging in there. However, I'm coming back and re-recording this specific sentence because while I was editing this video, things took a turn for the worst. I got a call from my sister on the night of April 24th letting me know that my dad had passed away. With that being said, just for context, everything else in this video after this specific sentence was recorded before my dad had passed. With me going through all of this though, I'm doing my best to keep my mental health as a priority for me. I'm surrounded by loved ones who are always available to talk to me no matter how hard things get, and that's something that I'm incredibly thankful for. I feel very fortunate to have that support system. On top of that though, making these videos over the last few years has been very therapeutic for me as well. When I'm going through it, pouring my heart, soul, and all of my feelings into a video is something that I find a lot of comfort in. It helps me process what I'm going through, and it's very beneficial for me working through the slew of emotions that I've had over the last few years. Whether it was the vicarious trauma that I took on working as a 911 dispatcher, or my dad's condition getting worse than it's ever been, I've been really fortunate to have this platform to pour those feelings into. Even bigger than that though, is the support that I've had from all of you. When I made that video letting you all know about what's going on with my dad, the amount of people who showed support in the comments was overwhelming. I scrolled through those comments and cried my eyes out, just feeling so thankful that I have so many people here that are quick to show some emotional support when my life reaches a really hard point. Every last one of you are so incredibly important to me, and I can't thank you all enough for showing some love and being here for me during this time. I want you all to know that I'm okay. I'm okay right now, and I'm going to be okay in the future. I have so much to look forward to in life and so many goals to achieve before I pass away at the ripe old age of 115. But with that being said, videos like this one are really important to my healing process and the preservation of my mental health. I'll admit this video isn't the most positive, but this is all part of my process, and right now this feels like a very important video for me to make. And that's why today, on our nostalgic walk down memory lane, we're checking out an episode of Courage the Cowardly Dog that shines a light on just how big of an effect depression can have on your life. We're looking at none other than the Season 2 finale, The Tower of Dr. Zalost. As the mysterious tower continues to hurl cannonballs at the city of nowhere, complemented by a beautifully written operatic score, we see the scowl of a green-faced man sporting bloodshot eyes with heavy bags under them quickly turn into an evil grin, implying that he's the one behind the message being sent to the people of nowhere. As the cannonballs continue to fly through nowhere, we notice that they're not causing any physical damage to any of the structures or people of the city. Instead, they seem to disappear on impact, leaving everyone in their wake green-skinned and miserably empty. As the attack is still commencing, we cut to a flashback, revealing exactly what led to these devastating events.
You already know my reputation. I am Dr. Zalost, the greatest unhappy scientist who ever lived. And I want $33.33 billion for my unhappy cannonball project.
The two government stooges laugh in his face, taken back by the idea of funding such a project. Dr. Zalost begins to threaten them, saying that if they don't fund his endeavor, he'll be using the city and all of its people for research, which will make everyone very unhappy.
Big deal. They're already unhappy. We just raised the taxes! The next time you try and bamboozle us, you'll be thrown in a clique. Now beat it!
Fools. I'll show them.
Just like that, we cut back to the current state of affairs as we see this massive tower mobilized by tank wheels and robot legs as it makes its way towards nowhere, hurling cannonballs like no tomorrow. Atop the tower, we see none other than Dr. Zalost, looking through a telescope and laughing maniacally at all of the sadness that he's causing.
We've been bamboozled!
That's correct, Mayor. If we don't pay up, we're next.
Okay, pay the madman.
As that's happening, we cut right over to a familiar farmhouse in the outskirts of nowhere late at night. Inside, we see Courage excitedly sitting at the kitchen table while Muriel is pulling some treats out of the oven.
Oh, Courage, my secret recipe for happy plums will make anything happy. Don't they smell delicious? Put a little sour cream in each, will you, Courage?
As Courage struggles to evenly distribute the sour cream onto the plums, we cut on over to the living room where Eustace is very upset because he never got his newspaper that was supposed to come in the morning. He calls the newspaper office, but the line is busy. Muriel reassures him that it's probably on the way, but unfortunately, that doesn't help.
You'll feel better after you've had some of my happy plums.
I don't want any happy plums. I want my paper. And there's nothing good on television either.
Muriel heads back to the kitchen, where we see Courage give up on evenly dispersing the sour cream, and instead he resorts to eating all 3 cups of happy plums. Muriel is excited to see that he loves them so much, and thankfully she says there's plenty left where that came from. Just then, Eustace calls for Muriel from the living room, telling her that there's a special report on the TV that she needs to see.
Earlier today, the city of Nowhere fell under attack from an unknown tower. But right now, I feel like going to bed. So that's all the news for today.
Eustace completely disregards the news report and decided that he's going to town to get his newspaper himself. Muriel warns him that it sounds dangerous, but he ignores her, walking out without even saying a word in response. Just then, we cut back to Dr. Zalost in the highest room of his tall tower as he watches a massive TV, surrounded by bags of money while eating a tub of ice cream in his fancy bed. Despite having all the money he could ever want, he still just looks absolutely miserable.
What's the good of having all the money in the world if it doesn't bring any happiness? And if I'm not happy, no one deserves to be happy. Rat? Rat. Come here, Rat. Give me a hug. It always calms me down.
The rat slams down the money that he's counting, as well as his hat, as he angrily walks over and gives Dr. Zalost a very half-hearted hug. This ends up hurting the doctor's feelings, as he tells Rat that he can tell that he isn't even trying. As the doctor tells him to get away if he isn't going to be sincere, we hear an alarm going off as the doctor receives a video call.
All right, Zalost, you have your money. Now return these miserable people of Nowhere back to happy miserable people.
Tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow. Or maybe never.
We had a deal, Zalost.
Well, the money didn't make me feel any better. And if I'm not feeling good, no one is. So there.
Zalost, you...
The doctor throws his remote, feeling angered by that conversation, saying that the mayor is just being selfish and how he can't stand people who only think about themselves. The doctor then invites Rat in for another shot at that hug, as we cut on over to Eustace, who was unsuccessful at getting his newspaper from Nowhere News. Eustace drives back home, complaining, until he comes upon the tower of Dr. Zalost, which he comes just mere inches away from hitting due to it sitting in the middle of the road.
Get that pile of junk out of the way!
Rat! Who is that? You didn't miss one, did you? You missed one. There's a happy person.
Eustace angrily drives around the tower as we see Dr. Zalost grab his telescope to get a better look at the situation. He spies with his big bloodshot eyes the farmhouse off in the distance as Eustace drives towards it. He connects the dots that if there's one happy person, there's bound to be more there, as he commands Rat to drive the tower towards the farm.
And this time, I expect you to get them.
As Muriel sits happily watching TV in the living room, Eustace walks in complaining about how not only did he not get his newspaper, but some stupid kids had their Jeep parked in the middle of the road. Muriel offers him the happy plums that she saved for him, but before he can respond, the entire house starts shaking wildly. Courage looks outside to see the ominous sight of the tower speeding directly towards the farm. Eustace and Muriel step out onto the porch as the cannonballs start to fly towards them.
Lousy teenagers!
He must be immune to emotions. Hit the round woman.
As Muriel turns green and gets overtaken by the depressive slump, the cannonballs keep flying. Eustace goes in to get his mallet while Courage starts jumping around to avoid the cannonballs. He grabs Muriel and hides her in a drawer inside while taking cover under the sink to preserve himself.
I think we got them. Now we can go back to bed and hug.
In the house, we see Muriel sitting in her rocking chair, slumped over, while Courage does everything he can to snap her out of it. Unfortunately, though, no amount of silly faces and encouragement are able to help. Courage even tries to feed her some of the happy plums, but much to his dismay, he can't even get her to eat. Courage stuffs the plums into his pocket to save them for later, and we see him sit down and meditate on it, coming up with an idea to make his way into the tower to find the cure for this overwhelming curse that's befallen his best friend.
Here's the pizza you ordered. $20. Woohoo! Whoopee! That stupid dog was right. That's the easiest $20 I've ever made.
As Rat goes upstairs to inform Dr. Zalost of his pizza that's arrived, Courage sneaks out of the pizza box and heads upstairs. He finds his way to a room with an incomprehensible amount of cannonballs everywhere, each of which being dunked into a vat of green liquid. Just then, Courage is shocked to hear the sound of Rat approaching him. Courage picks up a cannonball to defend himself with, but when that triggers a chain reaction of cannonballs falling, both him and Rat are swept away in the stampede of balls rolling away from the pile. In the commotion, Courage falls, sending a cannonball flying directly at Rat. Rat lunges towards Courage from high above, leaving Courage feeling terrified and helpless. However, he has the reassuring voice of Muriel in his head, reminding him that her happy plums will make anything happy. Courage quickly pulls the cup of plums out of his pocket, and he uses the spoon to catapult one of the plums into Rat's mouth, causing him to fall to the ground and transform into a small, innocent baby rat. As Rat lays there crying, Courage makes his way towards the stairs as he ascends up to the chambers of Dr. Zalost.
Welcome to the Tower of Dr. Zalost. I bet you thought you would come in here and do something very heroic, right?
The doctor decides to play a game with Courage. He promises to turn Muriel back to normal if Courage can guess the 4-letter word on the board before the cannonball nearby goes off. Courage agrees, and the doctor lights the fuse as a life or death game of hangman commences. Courage guesses letter after letter, getting all of them incorrect, until it gets to the point where he only has one guess left. He ends up buying a vowel from Dr. Zalost as he guesses O, getting the 2 middle letters correct. As Courage sits there, scared for his life, being tormented by the doctor, he thinks as hard as he can to connect the dots.
You cheated!
Courage jumps all over the room, dodging all of the cannonballs that Dr. Zalost continuously fires his way. He ends up making it all the way up to the ominous-looking crane as he rides it up to the next level above. However, he's surprised to find that the doctor beat him there and even had time to stop for an ice cream cone. The doctor holds Courage by the throat and makes his way over to the hole in the ground that lies directly above the vat of green liquid that infects the cannonballs with its deadly curse. As the doctor chokes Courage and prepares to drop him down into the vat, we yet again hear the sound of Muriel's words echoing in Courage's mind, reminding him about the happy plums and their ability to make anything happy. The entire tower starts to shake as the doctor runs away in a panic. Meanwhile, pink cannonballs are starting to fly all over the place. The tower erupts in a massive explosion as its top pops off, and the pink cannonballs start hurling towards the city of nowhere. As the plume of smoke rises, we see Courage run out of the tower, carrying the baby rat and one of the pink cannonballs. He takes cover in the house and sets the rat down. The rat runs away in fear, and just then, Dr. Zalost bursts through the door angrily, holding a cannonball that he's saved just for Courage. We see Courage swiftly throw his pink cannonball at Muriel, ridding her of the depressing curse, and he picks her up to run for cover.
I found me mallet. Hooray! Stupid dog!
Dr. Zalost walks towards the kitchen as we see Muriel and Courage hiding underneath the table for cover. He walks through the door as Courage covers Muriel's mouth not to alert the doctor of their presence. We see the doctor approach the table as he spots the cup of happy plums.
Plums, my favorite. What is this? I've never felt so happy.
It's my secret recipe for happy plums.
Rat, come here, Rat. Give me a hug.
With Dr. Zalost and the rat ridden of their depression and anger, they hug it out while Muriel admires just how sweet of a moment that it is. And just like that, the episode comes to an end. This episode truly is a sight to behold. There's so much symbolism here and so much to be learned from the events that this one portrayed. It hits really hard on multiple different levels. First of all, on the whole, this episode really symbolizes the importance of love. This idea takes more of a physical form throughout the episode in being portrayed by Muriel's plums. In the beginning, we see Muriel making her special happy plums. Courage ends up eating them all, and the two share a very sweet and loving moment where she's completely okay with that. She brushes it off, saying that there's plenty left and that she's just so happy that Courage enjoys them. The love that exists between Courage and Muriel is a very pure and healthy love. It's that special, unconditional love that some people end up searching their whole lives for. Throughout this scene, we feel that love in a very pure way. On top of feeling that love in relation to the plums throughout that scene though, the plums themselves are pretty much heart-shaped. Then, ultimately, the plums ended up being the cure to the depression that has inflicted not only Dr. Zalost, but also everybody in town. The plums falling into the vat are what caused it to turn happy, and the doctor's evil scheme to hurt everyone quickly turns into the exact opposite of the effect that he had desired. It ended up being love that had the biggest effect on Dr. Zalost and all of those affected by the depression. This right here speaks volumes in a huge way, and I'll expand on that in a moment. Before I do though, we have to get some more context as we take a look at the doctor and his interactions with Rat. Specifically speaking, during that scene where he's in his room watching the massive TV and eating ice cream in bed. First of all, I have to point out that this right here really depicts depression in a real way for many people. For a lot of us, it looks like comfort seeking. Sitting around in your pajamas all day, staying in bed, indulging in things that bring joy and make us feel good. However, as good as those things may feel, they aren't always the answer. This is evidenced by the way that Dr. Zalost admits that though he has all the money he could possibly want, he's still incredibly unhappy and unfulfilled. In response to recognizing that feeling, he turns and asks Rat for a hug, saying that it always calms him down. When he does that, we see his demeanor change slightly, and the dramatic music changes to more of a calm and happy music. This right here is telling us that deep down inside, Dr. Zalost wants to be loved and cherished. He wants to change. He doesn't want to be afflicted by this depression any longer. However, he's struggling to find exactly what he needs to snap out of the depressive funk that he's stuck in. Ultimately, the thing that he needed was love. However, he couldn't find that in the way that he was living his life, and unfortunately, he wasn't able to find that from Rat. He asks Rat for a hug, and Rat slams down his money in his hat, lets out a big sigh, and begrudgingly walks over for a half-hearted hug. This whole interaction in general symbolized a few things. First of all, him giving Dr. Zalost a half-hearted hug and not really caring about him or being there for him. Rat didn't want to be doing that. He didn't want to comfort the doctor, and he didn't want to be his emotional support, but he still put on the act like he was willing to do it. This, in a way, highlights the danger of offering someone a shoulder to cry on and some care without genuinely intending on caring or hearing them out in the first place. That, in turn, gives that person a false hope that there's someone they can reach out to who cares, when really, they don't care. It's like that friend who says, "Hey, I know you're struggling and I'm here for you. Call me anytime you're going through it and I'll be there." Then you try calling them for the first time, and they just don't answer and never call you back. Or like that person who knows good and well that their friend is struggling because they make it obvious just to hit them with the, "Hey, let me know if you want to talk." I'm sorry, but if you know your friend is going through a really tough time in their life and kind of living on the edge, don't leave it up to them to reach out to you first. Oftentimes, when people are going through depression or having negative thoughts, they don't want to reach out or aren't going to reach out because to them, they can feel like they're being a burden. At minimum, at least hit them with a, "Hey, can we talk about it?" By all means, if they say no or don't respond, it's not on you to push further and force them to, but by just simply changing that verbiage in a very small way, you go from the rat who's half-heartedly offering a hug to a good friend who's genuinely there when someone you care about is possibly moments away from a disastrous breakdown. On a completely different note though, there's another big thing that the half-hearted hug highlights. It shines a light on how hard it is to be there for someone who's struggling when you yourself are struggling. It's honestly a huge and very valid struggle to allow someone else to open up to you about their problems when you yourself are longing for someone to open up to about your own problems. One big thing that affirms this for us in this episode is the point where Rat ends up being fed the happy plums. He eats it, and it quickly turns him into a small, crying baby rat. Using the context at the end of this episode, we see everyone turn back to normal after eating the plums to cure their depression. It doesn't age them down, it turns them back to their normal self. With that in mind, throughout the events of this entire episode, Rat is just a baby. I feel like this is hinting about his inner child being damaged more or less. He's just a kid, but being around Dr. Zalost and his depressive influence had hardened him and tainted his inner child. With that in mind, it makes sense that Rat wouldn't want to give Dr. Zalost that reassurance that he was craving. I don't blame Rat for not wanting to give him that hug, because deep down inside, I'm sure that Rat would like a hug from someone who actually loves and cares about him too. But he likely feels like the doctor can't be the one to provide that for him, considering that the doctor himself is the one that brought Rat to this point. Ultimately though, this episode tells the story of not just one, but two people who are extremely depressed in every sense of the word. They're afflicted by it in different ways because, of course, like we already talked about, depression affects everyone differently. However, in the long run, the plums ended up being the answer. Circling back to what I said earlier, this speaks volumes without a doubt. Just like we saw Rat eat a plum and revert back to his normal baby self, we also see the doctor do the same thing in the end. He eats the plums, coughs a bit as he transforms, and next thing you know, we see him no longer being green and sporting a completely different demeanor. The beauty of it though is that it didn't take anyone forcing Dr. Zalost to see that the plums were the answer. He was happily willing to eat them on his own accord. He wanted to eat them. Now, again though, keep in mind exactly what those plums symbolize. Love. The doctor craved to feel love, and when he finally found that love, he changed back to his normal self. This symbolizes him finding his relief from his depression, and it shows us that he's wanted nothing but to find that same relief all along. Then, once both him and Rat found their relief from the cloud of depression that shrouded them, they're able to finally embrace one another with a loving hug that actually came from a place of pure intentions. This, ultimately, was a very beautiful moment. It really shines a big light on just how destructive two people can be when they're both going through a really hard time, but aren't able to be there for each other because of that hard time and the rough emotions that come along with it inherently. However, it also highlights how, conversely, these same exact two people can be really healthy for one another when they've worked through the struggles that they've been going through individually. Rat had a hard time giving the doctor a hug and being there for him when the two of them were going through their hard times. But on top of that, there was another really small thing in this episode that you may have missed, but it also came with a slew of symbolism. In the end, when we see Dr. Zalost storm into Eustace and Muriel's house, he's still angry and drowning in his depression. At this moment though, Rat, having been cured of his depression and being reverted back to his normal baby form, actually runs up and tries to give the doctor a genuine hug by latching onto his leg. However, Dr. Zalost is quick to kick his leg, tossing Rat to the side and disregarding the love that he's trying to show him. This said so much about depression and how it affects people. At this point, Rat's finally reached a state where he's willing to genuinely give the doctor the hug and love that he's been craving this entire time. However, the doctor is in a state where he's hit rock bottom. He's depressed to no end, and he had all the money he could have ever wanted, only to have it completely destroyed, leaving him with nothing, not even a depressed Rat by his side. We all know that misery loves company, and at this point, he doesn't even have that company that he had in the beginning. This, to me, highlighted how everyone moves through hard times and conquers their demons at different paces. Rat had already had his plums. He moved past the anger and depression, and he was ready to show his love. But at this point, the doctor was still going through it and hadn't moved past his depression yet. He wasn't ready to accept the hug from Rat because he was focused on getting revenge on Courage, mainly due to the fact that he was still struggling. So as a result, he kicks Rat, pushing him away and possibly hurting him in the process. It was really sad to see, but eventually, when the doctor was able to eat the plums and revert back to his normal self, it was like a breath of fresh air seeing the two of them come together to embrace one another, having both found their peace. Circling back though to the doctor having all the money he could have ever wanted, it's definitely worth pointing out that this episode taught us a good lesson in how money isn't always the answer. Don't get me wrong, money can be the answer, but it isn't always the answer. The whole premise of this episode was Dr. Zalost coming to the local government and demanding money from them to fund his project. However, the project clearly didn't need funding. By this point, he already had it down to a T, with hundreds of cannonballs already produced and ready to be sent flying from his mobile tower. Sure, the project was partially his excuse and his threat to get the money, but ultimately the real reason he wanted the money was because he thought that was the key to unlocking his happiness and freeing him from his depression. But quickly, the doctor found that having all the money and nice things meant absolutely nothing to him without having the loving embrace of someone who genuinely cares about him. You can have all the money in the world, but that alone isn't the answer to no longer being lonely and sad. Money can't scratch the itch for genuine connection and unconditional love. On top of all this though, we definitely have to take a moment to talk about Eustace and his role in this episode. At the point where Dr. Zalost is barreling towards the farmhouse and hurling his cannonballs at it, we see Eustace get hit, and he's the only person who's completely unfazed by them. Dr. Zalost claims this must be because Eustace is immune to emotions, and that, honestly, I feel is a pretty valid assessment of the situation. This, to me, really says a ton about Eustace and the trauma that he carries with him. His emotional cup isn't a cup anymore. It's a mason jar that has the lid tightly screwed on and sealed so that nothing can get in or out. A lot of times, Eustace is portrayed as stone cold, oftentimes showing no emotion at all, or if he does, it's usually one adjacent to anger and hostility. The sad truth about Eustace, though, is that this isn't really his fault. It comes as a part of growing up the way that he did and the life that he's lived. It's shown time and time again in this show that Eustace grew up feeling like he was always inferior to his brother Horst. He always felt like he was living in his shadow because of how much of a strong and successful man that Horst was. On top of that, though, his brother was never really afraid to rub Eustace's nose in it, oftentimes bullying him and giving him the nickname Useless. On top of the strained relationship with his brother, though, Eustace has always felt like he could never fill his father's shoes in the same way that Horst could. This isn't evidenced by any interaction that we've seen Eustace have with his father, however. It's evidenced to us through the various episodes where Eustace's own mother tells him that, which is another huge problem in and of itself. Eustace essentially grew up feeling like he was never good enough, never loved, and never accepted by anyone, especially his own mother. There's many episodes that do a really good job of showing us what led to Eustace being the way he is, and I'd love to make a video highlighting those episodes in the future. But it's safe to say, for the sake of this video, that Eustace likely closed off his emotional cup a long time ago when he was a little kid, and as a result, by this point, he's immune to emotions because he's had them locked up for decades upon decades at this point. If there's anything else I'd like to bring up as it relates to all of this, it's the correlation to this episode and antidepressants. There's a lot of references here that tell us plain as day that this episode is tackling the subject of depression if it wasn't already obvious enough. The first being the antagonist's name. If you type Zalost into Google Translate, you'll get a plethora of results, all of which stem from various Slavic dialects. These results include mourning, sorrow, grief, regret, chagrin, bereavement, distress, and affliction. Ultimately, it's clear that his name is derived from a negative connotation in general. However, we have to point out that in the English language, Zalost is likely a reference to a very popular antidepressant, Zoloft. On face value, a lot of people look at this episode and think that the plums might represent antidepressants. However, I'm of the opinion that is quite the opposite of what's being portrayed. I've made it clear that in my opinion, the plums represent love. I feel like that's something that they very strategically laid foundation of understanding for right from the get-go. However, I do feel like there is something here that's supposed to represent antidepressants to a degree, and that would be the cannonballs. I say to a degree because it doesn't have to be antidepressants specifically, but more or less pharmaceuticals and drugs in general. These drugs, often prescribed by doctors, can be very beneficial for some. Some people try antidepressants, and it does an amazing job of snapping them out of their funk and supporting them living a happy and positive life. However, like I said earlier, recovering from depression looks different for everyone. What works for some might not work for others. What could be a miraculous pill for one person could be what leads to another person's brain chemistry being completely thrown out of whack and resulting in very adverse and sometimes deadly effects. Not to mention the process of coming off of some of these drugs. Then of course, we have to circle back to Dr. Zalost himself. In the beginning, we see him demanding money from the government in a very threatening way. This right here, one could potentially see as an interesting portrayal of the relationship between the government and massive pharmaceutical companies. These companies put a lot of work into securing their funding, urging doctors to prescribe their product, and of course, advertising that product all over our media. I'll never forget learning the fact that these happy commercials for different medications that I've been seeing on TV since I was a little kid are actually very uncommon outside of the United States. But focusing on this episode though, one could definitely see Dr. Zalost hurling all of these depression cannonballs at everyone, akin to how people get hooked on pharmaceuticals and other drugs. And oftentimes, the result of that addiction is similar to the reactions we see from everyone afflicted in this episode. I mean, just look at how it affected Muriel. She went from being her normal, happy, and productive self to essentially being a miserable and empty shell of a person who literally didn't want to do anything or even interact with her family. I feel like, in an interesting way, this episode really highlights the dangers of being prescribed a medication when that isn't the answer to your problem. And then, of course, the fallout that can occur in the aftermath of being addicted to the medication that you were pushed to take by a doctor. But of course, I have to stress, that's coming from a place that recognizes that this certainly isn't a generalized blanket statement. Pharmaceuticals exist for a reason. For some people, they can be very beneficial and helpful, but that's not the case for everyone who suffers with any ailment, be it depression or not. I also have to take just a moment to point out the irony of the government stooges in the beginning. Dr. Zalost threatens to make everyone in Nowhere unhappy if they refuse to pay him. However, they laugh in his face, saying that everyone is already unhappy because they raised the taxes. Then, after everyone is afflicted by these cannonballs, they end up begging the doctor to turn those miserable people into happy miserable people. The irony of all this is just so ridiculous in my opinion. I'm not going to sit here and complain about taxes, but I'll definitely point out the fact that inflation has gone completely through the roof. Meanwhile, the federal minimum wage hasn't changed at all in a whopping 15 years. I just can't help but chuckle at how relevant this entire interaction was, even looking back at this episode 22 years after it aired. Going in a completely different direction, there's certainly a few things I'd love to touch on in an effort to end this video on a more happy note, much like how the episode itself ended on a happy note. First things first, the music in this episode is such a mesmerizing aspect to behold, and it really did a phenomenal job of essentially portraying the emotions that they were trying to capture. It was utilized in a truly special way that definitely made this episode land very well. The operatic score is just so fitting, and it was a truly beautifully composed piece of music that accompanied this episode in a very dramatic and perfect way. The music fell in line with the events of this episode flawlessly. If I wanted to highlight any aspect of this one though, it would be the beginning sequence. The first few minutes of this episode very strategically portrayed both real-time and past events at once, and it definitely added a charming effect to this episode. The beginning of this one is very strong, and I have to commend this show for that. This episode starts out with an attack on Nowhere commencing. We have no context, no reason, and we don't even know who's doing it. Then, all of a sudden, we cut to a flashback that, odds are, you as a viewer might not even realize is a flashback. They don't change the colors to black and white or add any distorted border or anything like that to make it obvious that a flashback is happening. It's the kind of thing where as the attack is in the middle of happening, they disperse these bits of context throughout the sequence, and it's not something that we see happen very often in cartoons. It's a really cool thing to soak in, keeping in mind that this show in general oftentimes plays on horror movie tropes and storylines. In this one, they play on what felt like very serious cinematography, and I feel like that, in combination with the beautiful music that they paired with it, really made for a strong opening for this episode. One other thing that I feel like really added an amazing level of charm to this episode is the sequence where we cut around town to see just how many people are being afflicted by the depression sweeping the city. We go from shot to shot at different locations, all the meanwhile the characters they're showing are all from previous episodes. All people from Courage's past. This is something that I've pointed out in this show before, but I always have to take a moment to appreciate. There's a lot of shows that will juggle the same handful of incidental characters meant to fill the background space. Most of them, we don't even know what they sound like or anything about their personality. However, with this show, as it continued on, they would utilize characters from the past, and I feel like that definitely adds another layer of charm, because we all are familiar with these characters for the most part. Most of them we've seen star in an episode previously, so we know what their voices sound like, and we know what their personality is. Sure, that may be a really small thing, but a lot of the time, it's the minute details that can really make a show stand out from the rest, especially as far as cartoons are concerned. But what do you guys think? Did this video change the way that you look at this episode? Let me know in the comments down below. I always love seeing your guys' feedback. I want to take a sec to say thank you so much to my patrons, especially those of you in the true 90s kids tier. I appreciate all of you more than words could ever say, and I really can't thank you enough for being a part of my YouTube journey. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like and give a little praise to the algorithm in hopes that it pushes this one to everyone else. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.